Okay, welcome to Proverbs class. We've got all the technology sorted out and all the people organised. That's great. So what we might do is take a quick reading from Proverbs chapter 2, and we might just read the first 12 verses. So Proverbs 2, verse 1. My son, if thou wilt receive my words and hide my commandments with thee, so that thou incline thine ear unto wisdom, and apply thy heart to understanding, yea, if thou criest after knowledge, and lift up your voice for understanding, if you seek her as silver and search for her as hid treasures, then shalt thou understand the fear of Yahweh and find the knowledge of God. For Yahweh gives wisdom, out of his mouth comes knowledge and understanding. He lays up sound wisdom for the righteous. He is a buckler to them that walk uprightly. He keeps the paths of judgment and preserves the way of the saints. And when shalt thou understand righteousness and judgment and equity, yea, every good path? When wisdom enters into thine heart and knowledge is pleasant unto thy soul, discretion shall preserve thee, understanding shall keep thee, to deliver thee from the way of the evil man, from the man that speaks froward things, who leave the paths of uprightness to walk in the ways of darkness. So we're continuing our consideration in this section. We saw how at the beginning of this chapter we had this general discussion about wisdom, and the father saying to the son, look, you need to hide your commandments with thee, to make my commandments part of you. They need to find a place inside you, and they need to direct your life. And then in verse 5, we saw this transition to this idea of the fear of Yahweh and the knowledge of God. And so verse 6 through this chapter, we have this focus, this slight refocus around how it's Yahweh's operation in our lives, which is going to provide us the necessary tools to avoid the major traps in life. And in this chapter, the two big traps that we've discussed in the past are being explored. You've got the trap of the evil man in verse 12, and you've got the trap of the harlot in verse 16. And these two, I guess you'd call them the lieutenants of sin, but a bad way of representing them, are two aspects of life which are a trap to everybody. The inclination to take the shortcut in life to get the maximum benefit rather than the wise approach, which is to develop the character through a process of going from the simple to the youth to the wise to the man of knowledge and understanding. Whereas the lure of the evil man and the gang that we looked at in Proverbs chapter 1 is that you can take a shortcut. You can become a get-rich-quick scheme, get-rich-fast scheme, and they want to bypass the necessary steps throughout life to get to the maximum benefit they can. And the end thereof, as the father warns his son, is destruction. So coming to verse 7, we read here, he lays up sound wisdom for the righteous. He is a buckler to them that walk uprightly. And the idea here of lays up is the idea of a warehouse. God has laid up sound wisdom for the righteous, and it's got the idea of success. So the word sound wisdom there, the Hebrew has the idea of efficient wisdom, abiding success. It's not wisdom in the sense of skillfulness that we looked at before. This has got the idea of success, the wisdom that provides you with maximum success. It's got the idea of efficiency. It's got the idea of success about it. And it's the idea of the reward of wisdom. And so if we live a wise life and we conduct ourselves prudently and wisely, what we find is that there is a reward stored up for us, and it's promised to us. It's a bit like we saw last week when we were looking at the children of darkness and the children of light, and how Christ compared them. And Christ said, if you're not faithful in those things which are least, if you're not faithful in the things which don't belong to you, then why would you receive the things that do belong to you, your birthright, that which has been laid up for you in the future? If you can't be faithful in the things that are small and insignificant today, then why would you expect that you would be rewarded you would receive your birthright? Why would you expect to receive your inheritance if you can't be faithful? And so this is the same concept, this idea of laying up and being provided for, and God's going to provide for his children, and there's a promise at the end of that. And it's interesting that the Greeks themselves, they sought wisdom. They were always interested in new things and new ideas and new concepts, and they wanted to debate for the sake of debating and argue for the sake of arguing. And this is the issue that Paul addresses in Corinthians with the different groups, the different factions. They were always interested in a new thing, and they were interested in the wisdom of the world. But the wisdom of the world doesn't provide an eternal hope, doesn't provide an eternal benefit. And you've got the comparison in Proverbs 14 of those who supposedly seek wisdom. Verse 6, the scorner seeks wisdom, but he doesn't find it. But knowledge is easy to him that understands. And so you've got the scorner who, you really can't teach that person, because no matter what you say, they've always got a better idea, and they already know. And so they seek wisdom, inverted commas, but it's really not to their benefit, because they're not prepared to take it on. Whereas those who have invested in developing knowledge and understanding, and have the discipline of developing knowledge and understanding, those people find wisdom comes easy. They've invested in the time and the effort to get the basics and the structures right, to understand how to argue and what arguments look like, and then what the framework of wisdom is. That when they're researching and when they're searching out new wisdom, they develop that knowledge and that wisdom quickly. And it's the same with the scriptures. If you've got a good basic understanding of the framework of the Bible, and you've got a good basic understanding of the key concepts of the Bible, the three promises, the fundamental basics of the atonement, the way that types are used, the way that synonyms are used, the way that metonymy is used in the Bible. When you start reading through the Bible, you might be in Genesis, but then your mind goes, oh, I've actually read something very similar to that in Revelation. Or you might be studying David, but then you think, well, hold on, this actually comes up in Acts. And you can start to build. You can use those fundamental building blocks to develop wisdom and understanding. And so it's a reward in its own way. It actually helps build and develop our comprehension. And so Solomon goes on and he says that God is a buckler to them that walk uprightly. So a buckler is actually a small shield, and it's not designed for defending you against arrows. In fact, as you can see there, they're pretty useless for protecting you against arrows and missiles. But they're actually an interesting piece of armor, because they're really designed for close quarter combat, and they are designed for deflecting melee weapon or melee battle items, and they're also considered a weapon. So often the edge of the buckler would be sharpened, so that you could also use it like a blade, or as something to stun or to knock back your opponent. And it's interesting that it's a buckler and not a tall shield. So if you look at the full, if you go to Ephesians chapter 6 and you look at the whole armor of God, that shield that he talks about is a full shield. It's a tower shield that covers the whole body, whereas this shield is a small shield. And so what we're being told here is that when things get up close and personal, and you're in the middle of a fight with sin, and it's hand to hand, God is like this small shield. He provides you with sufficient protection to deflect the blows of the wicked. He provides you with an alternative form of attack, but he's preserving you, and he's protecting you from receiving any serious damage. The same word is actually used in Genesis chapter 15. If you come across the Genesis 15, this is an interesting context. This is Abraham's life. And Abraham here is in a quandary. Genesis chapter 15, verse 1, he says, after these things, the word of Yahweh came to Abraham. So what had happened? Well, the previous chapter, we read about Lot being taken captivity, that the area of Sodom and Gomorrah had been overthrown by the northern kings. Massive armies come down and taken them all into captivity, and killed a lot of people and dragged them off. We read in verse 12 of chapter 14 that they took Lot, Abraham's brother's son, and that who dwelt in Sodom, and took all his goods, and they departed. And it was told to Abraham in verse 13 what had happened. Now, of all things, an Amorite comes and tells him, by the way, we heard that your nephew had been taken captivity. And so the next thing that Abraham does is he rounds up his trained men, 300, the massive army of 318, and he goes out and he's going to go and rescue his nephew. Now you think about that, like you've got, how many, I think was it 6 kings in verse 1 of 14. Amraphel, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 kings versus I think it's the 4 kings in verse 2. So these all come down with their massive armies and all their weapons and all their armor and their horses and their chariots and everything else that they can muster to go and take out the Sodom and Gomorrah. And they're all heading back to home, and Lot's amongst them. And Abraham decides that he's going to go and rescue Lot. Now, I think, if you're a military person, your immediate consideration would be, well, that's probably going to be a challenge because we're probably outnumbered 10 to 1 given the size of the army of these 5 kings. But Abraham doesn't think twice about it. He rounds up his men, he divides himself up, and he goes out and amazingly he destroys them. Does it say that verse 15, he divided himself against them, he and the servants by night, and he smote them and pursued them unto Hobah, which is on the left hand of Damascus. And so he overthrows them and he rescues Lot. So it's just an incredibly amazing victory that you've got such a small group of people able to overthrow this massive army. And so when you get to verse 1 of chapter 15, Abraham's concerned because he's thinking, look, the potential for retribution is significant. Like, we've won a victory against these people. We've rescued Lot. I've basically snubbed the king of Sodom and said, I wouldn't even take a penny off you. And here we are, nomads, essentially living in tents with no walls and no protection of any kind, with our herds and our flocks wandering around the hills and our people scattered hither and yon. And he's concerned. He's like, this could go really badly for me. This could go really terribly. And God says to him in verse 1, fear not, for I am thy shield. It's the same word buckler there. I'm thy shield and thy exceeding great reward. The same concepts, the same ideas that we see in Proverbs chapter 2, verse 7. This idea of God has laid up a reward and God is a defender. So he's saying, I've laid up a reward for you and you're going to get it because I'm going to make sure you do. You're going to receive your reward because I'm your buckler and I'm your protector, and I'll ensure that you do. And so Abraham goes on and he suggests maybe Eliezer of Damascus, verse 2, as his heir, as the next one. And God says to him, listen, calm down. You need to take a step back and calm down, because this isn't you versus the world or you versus all the nations around you. This is you and me versus the world and all the nations around you. I'm with you. You don't have to be concerned. You're going to get the reward. You are going to get the seed of promise. And this Eliezer will not be that seed of promise. Right? That seed will issue forth from you. In verse 4, God says that. Right? And just to confirm that, he takes them out and he says, look at the stars. Can you count them? And that's an impossible task. And Abraham believed Yahweh and it was counted for him for righteousness. So the context of Abraham's faith is in the context of his fear of retribution from those kings and from retribution from Sodom and Gomorrah. Right? And yet God said, you don't have to fear. I'm your buckler. I'm your shield, and I will protect you from any potential retribution or any potential harm that might come upon you. And God says the same thing to us. And that's what we're being told in Proverbs chapter 2. God's saying to us, listen, you might look at the circumstances of your life. You might think about the challenges that you're facing. And we all face challenges from time to time. Sometimes they're very, very trying and very, very challenging. And what God's saying is, calm down. This is not just you versus the world or you versus this problem. This is you and me. You and I are both in this together. I'm with you in this. And I'm your shield and your buckler. And I've promised you a reward, and I'm going to make sure you receive that reward. So maintain your commitment, maintain your faith, pursue the goal, don't give up, keep your focus. Right? And that's what he's saying. And that's what he said to Abraham. And this is the same concepts we see in this verse here in verse 7. And so he says here that he is a buckler to them that walk uprightly. The word uprightly there is most often translated integrity throughout Scripture. It means to be innocent of any crime, to have a good conscience, and to act upon that good conscience. I guess another way of saying that is that this person's blameless. And so, we think about what does blameless mean? Well, blameless means that you're without sin, you're without charge, you're without criticism. And we think about our lives and go, well, there's lots of scenarios where I probably deserve criticism, and there's lots of scenarios where I haven't been blameless. But that's not the way God sees it. God looks at us and he perceives us to be blameless. He's forgiven our sins. Our baptism into Christ, our sins have been washed away. We're now committed to a path of becoming Christ. And because we're committed to that path, God says, as far as I'm concerned, you are Christ. I'm going to allocate that perspective to you now. Now, I know you've got your challenges and your problems and your issues, and I know you're going to mess things up sometimes, and I know that sin is going to be a constant burden in your life. I get that, but that problem's been fixed. I've fixed that problem through my Son, Jesus Christ. So as far as I'm concerned, you're without blame. As far as I'm concerned, you're innocent of any crime. And it's an amazing position for God to place us in, because we know what we're like. We know the challenges that we have in our lives and how sin so easily besets us, and the constant demons that regularly reappear in our lives and cause us to be worried about our salvation and worry us that if anybody ever found out about this and all those things. But as far as God's concerned, it's like, well, I've solved that problem. That's been fixed. We've fixed that. What I need you now to do is to stay the course. What I need you to do now is not second guess my promises. What I need you to do now is to maintain the process of developing the character of Christ in you. So God forgives us and he clears the space for us to become Christ. That's the purpose for the forgiveness of sins. The purpose of the forgiveness of sins is so that we are now free to serve God. So we've got liberty in Christ. The liberty in Christ is to serve Christ and not sin. And so we're freed up. And so God looks at us and he says, as far as I'm concerned, you're innocent of any crimes. I've pardoned you. I know all about all that stuff. Yes, I know, but as far as I'm concerned, you're pardoned. Now get on with the job of becoming Christ. And so he says in verse 8, he keeps the paths of judgment and preserves the way of the saints. The word keep there is the idea of to guard, to patrol. It's a bit like the bodyguard. And here's a very chiseled, handsome man in a black suit who's probably got a Glock under his left arm, and he's the bodyguard. He's protecting the charge, and God is protecting the way. He's protecting and watching over the path of judgment and all those that are walking in that path of judgment. Come across to Psalm 121. This is a really lovely psalm where God talks about this idea of protecting, of keeping. It's kind of, in some respects, the guard psalm. The word comes up numerous times. Psalm 121, the word comes up in verse 13, verse 3, verse 4, verse 5, verse 7. The word preserve is the same word in verse 8. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times it comes up in this psalm. So he says, the psalmist says, I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills from whence cometh my help. And so here you've got the psalmist and he's in dire straits, and the situation is, so if you watch that movie, what's it, Lord of the Rings, and I think it's where they're in the city with the dwarves and all the army, the bad guys all turn up, the orcs with the swords, and they surround the army and they're trying to blow the walls up, and dawn is coming and things are looking terrible. They've been fighting all night and the whole situation is a complete disaster. And they look over the hill, and then along comes a very sprightly 85-year-old in the form of Gandalf with an army. And, it's like this idea of the army rising up over the side of the hill and looking down on the city. And the defenders are like, oh, this is terrible. We're all going to die. And all the attackers are like, yay, we've won the day. It's going to be our city. And then over the top, it's like, oh, this doesn't look good, Gary. This is a real problem. Look at that army over there. And the armies come across the top, and here they are with their swords and their spears and their shields. And then we know the answer. It's a big hooray moment. They'll come charging down the hill and wipe out the orcs and the bad guys, and they get obliterated. But that's the kind of idea. Like, here he is. He's in the thick of battle in the valley, and he's fighting for his life. And he's looking to the hills going, any minute now the cavalry are going to come in. any minute now the cavalry's going to come in. And so this is the picture he's painting. So he says, my help comes from Yahweh, which made heaven and earth. That's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because his confidence is so strong. He's saying, I've got absolute confidence that Yahweh can save me out of this situation. After all, he made heaven and earth. And in our Genesis classes, we've been looking at the creation story and how that maps to our lives. And so here is Yahweh, which made heaven and earth, and he's like, I've got absolute confidence that God can save me. He will not suffer your foot to be moved. He guards you when you sleep. Behold, he guards Israel, and he never sleeps and he never slumbers. He's always on the job. He's always protecting and watching over. He goes on and he says, Yahweh is your protector, your guard. Yahweh is the shade upon thy right hand. It's interesting, isn't it? Because the shade is that which is cast from another object across another object. And so the idea here is that God is so close to you that his shadow falls over you. So if you go to the beach, we go to the beach a bit because we live near Mangawai, and the boys will be walking beside me and the sun's shining and my shadow falls across my son. And so he's in my shadow. You have to be really close for that to happen. Like, I can't be down the other end of the beach for my shadow, even in the evening, I couldn't be down the other end of the beach for my shadow to be cast across my son. And so it's the same idea. Yahweh is so close to you. He's close protection. Right? He's close bodyguard protection, and he's so close that his shadow falls across you. That's how close he is to you. The sun will not smite thee by day, nor the moon by night. That's interesting, isn't it? So in the heat of the day, when you're most exposed outside, God's shadow protects you. He conceals you from the sun. He defends you from the heat of the sun. And by night, now it's an unusual thing to say, protects you from the moon by night. It's not like the moon is blisteringly hot and giving you sunburn. So what is he saying here? Or what he's saying is at night, when the moon is full and there's plenty of light around and the people who might be pursuing your life can see you, God conceals you from them. He's protecting you from the benefit that the moon might provide your attackers. That's the concept behind that. Yahweh shall preserve thee from all evil. He will preserve your life. And so he's saying there's all these various things that can go wrong in your life, all these evils that can beset you, and God is there defending you. And we don't even know. We're going to get to the judgment seat, and we're going to learn a lot more about ourselves than we've ever probably cared to know about ourselves at the judgment seat. That's going to be a process of development. That's the final aspect of the development of Christ in us, hopefully, when we receive the reward, or not, as the case may be. But we're going to learn so much about what God has been doing behind the scenes, and we had no idea. We were oblivious to the fact that God has been protecting us from evil. But there's been all these things that potentially have happened, which were on their way to trip us up and cause us to fail, and God has been intercepting them every time. Something's coming along to throw us off the path, and God says, no, I'm stopping that. And something else turned up and it's coming across the horizon, and God says, no, I'm stopping that. In some other scenario, or some other person decides they want to make life difficult, and God's like, nope, I'm not letting that happen. And so God is protecting us from all evil, and for the purpose of saving our souls. Yahweh shall protect your going out and your coming in from this time forth and forever and forevermore. That's an amazing thing, isn't it, brothers and sisters? Every time you go out of the house, God sent his bodyguards to look after you. And every time you come home from being out, God's bodyguards are bringing you back. You are continually safe. And it's that beautiful section in the Psalms earlier where David says, the army of God encamps around those who fear him. And so around your house at the moment, there's an encampment of angels in full armor protecting you. And when you go out of your house, that detail of angels goes with you. And we recall the story of Elisha in the city, which was surrounded by the Syrian army, and the servants like panicking. He's like, oh, we're all doomed. And Elisha says to God, let him open his eyes. And he opens his eyes, and then all the way around the hills is the army of God just encamped. And Elisha's like, man, you got nothing to worry about. Just calm down. Nothing bad's going to happen. It's going to be fine. And so this psalm is really a beautiful psalm about how God has a great care for his children, and we need to have confidence in that God is indeed our bodyguard, that God is indeed our buckler and our shield. Despite, there may be times when we've got to go to battle. There may be times when we've got to go out and fight the good fight in overwhelming opposition, and we feel that we're just so insignificant and small. And God says, don't you worry a thing. Don't you worry. I've got you. You're not going out by yourself. You're going out with the full army of the living God behind you. And so we should have that as confidence, and we should put our trust that there are going to be times when we're called upon to do difficult things. There are going to be times when we're called upon to stand up for the things of Christ, and we should do so in a humble and in a just way. That we should go and do it anyway, regardless of the fear. Feel the fear and do it anyway. And so verse 9 we read, then shalt thou understand righteousness and judgment and equity, yea, every good path. And so it's interesting, isn't it? Because God's saying on the one hand, he's going to protect you and preserve you, and you can have absolute confidence in that. So now you've got the space in the room to go and understand righteousness. Now you've got those worries should go away, and now you can dedicate your mind and your efforts towards understanding righteousness and equity and judgment, and walking in the path of God. And so the word understand here is again our word of understanding mentally, to distinguish, to know the difference, to separate mentally. We've looked at that quite a few times. The word righteousness means to act in the right way, so doing the right thing. So even in the face of opposition, even in the face of looking silly, even in the face of ridicule, even in the face of challenges, and it's like, well, we really don't want to have to do this because it's very difficult and it's awkward and I'm going to look like a fool. He said, you still do it because it's the right thing. It's the right thing to do. And Christ did that, didn't he? Christ did not want to go to the cross. If this cup can pass, then please let it pass. If there's a way out, if there's any way out, let's take the way out. But not my will, thy will. And so he had to face a very, very dark day. And yet, because it was the right thing to do, he went and did it. And the word justice here means to be able to adjudicate the argument. So it's rightly dividing between what is right and what is wrong, and passing a sentence. It's not an easy thing when you're presented with two arguments which both seem to be right, and you've got to make a decision about what is the right direction. And so he's saying here that we will be able to pass judgment, to do justly, to do what is the right thing, to be able to know the difference between right and wrong. And it's important because we need to know what is right and what is wrong before we're called upon to make a judgment. So we need to invest our time in understanding those things before we're actually needing to go and do those things. And the word equity here has the idea of to be straight or to be even. So it's not crooked, right? And so, the wicked are spoken about regularly throughout the Proverbs as being crooked. They are in crooked paths. Their paths are uneven. Their paths are broken up. It's a dangerous path. There's roots lying across the path. It twists and it turns. It goes up and it goes down. Whereas this path is a straight or an even path, and it's taking a balanced approach. It's taking the fastest route to the outcome. So it's understanding what is being able to mentally divide right and wrong, It's being able to have the confidence to pass a judgment upon what is right versus what is wrong, and it's getting there in the most efficient and quick and effective way, is the idea behind that verse. And so this is really about how God's saying we should order our lives. He's saying, so this is the way I want you to order your life. I want you to walk in paths, in every good path. I want you to walk in the good path, and I want you to order your life in accordance with justice and equity, and in keeping those paths and walking in those paths. And it's the same idea. It comes up in Micah chapter 6, verse 8, which is a lovely verse. Come across to Micah 6, verse 8. We read these words. God has shown thee, O man, what is good, and what does God require of thee. So God has shown you what is the good path. He's shown you the path in which you should walk. He's told you that this is what he wants you to do. This is how you should order your life, that you might do justly. Same idea, same word we find in Proverbs chapter 2 there, to love mercy and to walk humbly with thy God. So we should order our lives according to justice, mercy, and humility. And so coming to, what time is it? Okay, coming to verse 10, we read, when wisdom enters into thine heart and knowledge is pleasant to thy soul. Well, this is an interesting concept, isn't it? See, wisdom isn't an external thing. It's not something that is out there. It's not a reference book that we go to the library and pull off the reference book out of the library and look up, how do I deal with this situation? What he's saying is that wisdom has to be part of us. And the idea here is he's saying, look, wisdom doesn't abide with you naturally. You don't have, humans are not latently wise, despite what, the humanists of the world would suggest, like, even children have wisdom. It's like, no, they don't. No, Proverbs says that stupidity and foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child, not wisdom. And the best way of separating stupidity and foolishness from a child is to give them a smack on the backside and keep them disciplined. That's the best way to solve that problem. And so wisdom is something that has to come in. Wisdom is something that we have to allow to come into our hearts. And we have to invite it in. We have to be prepared to allow it to come in. It's people say, oh, it's a bit like the scorn. It's like, oh yeah, I'm all about wisdom. I'm all about learning new things and developing new skills and being such a wise person. And it's like, no, you're not. You're not interested in wisdom at all. You've never allowed wisdom to enter into your heart. Every time somebody tells you something wise, you scorn them. It's like, oh, you don't know anything. I know better than you. It's like, that's not wisdom. That's not developing wisdom. That's pushing wisdom away. And so we don't want to be like that. We want to be people who welcome wisdom in and are prepared to listen to wisdom. Even people who we may not think have a great deal of intellectual capacity, or maybe we don't think they have a great deal of wisdom, there may be things that they can tell us and explain to us that will save us a lot of pain and effort down the track. We should be open to wisdom at all times from everywhere, as long as it's wisdom, because a whole bunch of people who come out and they appear to be wise, they seem to be wise. And Paul makes this point in Corinthians: the wisdom of this world has an appearance of wisdom, and yet in reality it's actually just foolishness. And so we need to be able to judge wisdom, what is wise and what is not wise. The idea of knowledge here again is this idea of shrewdness and of cunning. And the word pleasant here is the idea of an appetite. It's delightful, it's sweet, it's lovely. This guy likes honey. I wouldn't say he's necessarily the wisest individual, but here is Winnie the Pooh, and he's got his hand very much stuck in the honey jar. And so he's got an appetite for that which is sweet. And so it's a developed taste. It's a taste we have to develop. We have to develop a inclination towards wisdom. And the challenge is that developing a taste for wisdom requires us to put the effort in. We have to put work in to developing that taste. So there's going to be good days and there's going to be bad days, but we have to maintain the development of that taste. Something we have to learn and adopt into our lives. And studying and researching and committing our time to writing is effort. It's hard work, and it's not something that comes naturally. Currently trying to educate our children in the value of being able to write, being able to articulate your ideas onto paper. And this is something I learned recently. The reason that you write things down, the reason that you narrate things, isn't so that you can transfer knowledge to other people. It's not the primary reason, although it's certainly a good reason. The reason you write things down and review things is it helps you to develop the ability to think, because our brains move so fast that we are unable to maintain the perspective of a complex concept or complex idea in our brains long enough for us to elucidate the value and critique the benefit of the concept or the idea. If you're trying to work out a complex problem in your head, it's really hard. Like, you try and do a one-page maths problem in your head, like, write down, memorize 10 numbers and then add them all up in your head. Now, people probably over the age of 60 can do that, because I was taught to do that at school. But for the vast majority of anybody under the age of 50, it's impossible. We have to write the numbers down, and then we have to go through and add them up long ways, because our brains have become so distracted and engineered in a way where we don't do that anymore. Why would I ever do that in my head? I can just use a calculator. I used to know our brother in the meeting at Eugenia, and he could do square roots of big numbers. He could do square roots of big numbers in his head. He was a smart guy, obviously, but it's insane. Like, how do you square root, a number which is in the tens of millions? What's the square root of 92,365,432.21? Just for fun. Like, what? What was? I don't even know what the number is now. And he would do that. So we write things down so that we can capture our ideas and articulate and critique them. That's the power of writing things down. And sadly, we've lost that skill. And we haven't lost it. Maybe that's a bit harsh. We're losing it. And it's not being explained to our children. It's not being articulated. The value of writing and the value of narration and the value of storytelling is not being explained to children in a way that they comprehend that this is a life skill that will save your life one day. That's the development of wisdom. It's such an important and critical thing to comprehend and understand. It's great that we write things down and pass that information on. That's useful. It has utility, but it's not the most important thing. The most important thing is that we can articulate our concepts and our ideas, that we can articulate wisdom into a document and then go and critique it and refine that concept and idea. It's us talking back to ourselves in a way which allows us to maintain the continuity of the argument, rather than the fool who, in Proverbs says this, the fool just opens his mouth and blah, 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 blah. And just stuff comes pouring out. And like, it hasn't been thought through, isn't well articulated, contradicts itself. And then when you criticize the basis of the argument and for its flaws, they get upset. Like, how dare you question me? It's like, how dare you waste my time with this stupidity? Go away and work it out. And that's what we should be doing. So verse 11, discretion shall preserve thee, understanding shall keep thee. This word discretion here means, again, this idea of a purpose, of a plot, of a strategy, of a plan. It's got the idea of the blueprint. We've looked at this before. It's what the young man needs in verse 4. Wisdom says, I'll give him knowledge and a plan for his life. The other translation says, a good mind will keep you, foresight will protect you, wise choices will protect you. This is the same idea of discretion This plan will protect you. So here's the question, right? We've discussed this before. What's the plan? Do you have a plan? Because if you have no plan, then you have a plan to fail. Like you're literally planning to fail if you don't have a plan. Because life's going to happen to you, and unless you've got some plan about how you're going to order your life, then life's going to get pretty miserable pretty quickly. Because you're just going to get smashed. You'll be like that boat without a rudder and without sails. Just whichever way the wind blows is whichever direction you get pushed, and whichever way the waves smash into the side of your boat is whichever way your boat's going to get spun. It's a pretty terrifying idea that, and people go through life. What's amazing is that people actually go through life like that. I know people, you probably know people who just seem to lurch from crisis to crisis to crisis. There is always some drama in their life. You're like, really? Like, aren't you sick of this? Like, it's just an emotional roller coaster. Aren't you over just the continual drama? Maybe they need the drama in their life. Maybe that gives them some sense of meaning. It's just exhausting watching people go through that. Just shake my head and go, really? Like, you realize there's a better way. There is actually a better way of doing this. Now, this works for you, great, but it doesn't look like it does. It certainly doesn't work for the people around you. The people around you are just shaking their heads and in a continual state of freaking out about what is going to happen next. What are you going to do next that's going to blow up? And so we want to have a plan. We need discretion. And the word understanding here is the idea of intelligence. The extension of skillfulness is actually this idea of wisdom that we've looked at before. It takes some real skill to be able to do that. If you want to fire an arrow, another arrow, and split the other arrow, you've got to be pretty clever. You need to be pretty good. We bought a bow and arrow. We bought some bows and arrows. We haven't actually used them recently, have we, Jasmine? And we've got hay bales, and I'm pretty good at missing the target. It's a real skill being able to draw an adult-sized bow and fire it at a target. And by the way, I make it easy for myself. The target's massive, so it's like essentially the size of a house is what I'm firing at. And, there's a good chance the arrow is going to go over the back and disappear into the grass on the other side. So there's some real skill. Skillfulness needs practice and effort. If you want to be this good, you need to put the effort in. You need to practice. And we need to accept that failure is an important, if not the most important, aspect of learning. It's something it's always amazed me. Having developed and run an international business, working with other cultures, particularly the US culture, their perspective of failure and risk is quite different to I'll call it the British system, because New Zealanders and Australians tend to be more aligned with the British system, not as aggressively as obviously the Brits are, but their idea of failure is the first activity in learning. So if you want to make an omelette, you've got to scramble a few eggs. So let's not get panicky about breaking some eggs. And so their perspective is failure is an important part of the process. And in fact, one of my business partners at the time had a venture capitalist, and one of the first questions I ask is, so how many businesses have you blown up? And how many businesses have you run, and how many of them have you blown up? Because there's nothing like blowing up a business to really understand that you never want to go back there again. Because blowing up a business is a horrible thing to do. And so, that's probably the worst failure you can experience in business, is blowing one up. So what did you learn from that? We're not going to give you money until we're confident that you've had a good education, and the best education is the education where you've failed miserably and learned from it. And so the process of developing understanding and learning is accepting that there's going to be failure. And again, this word keep here, I've lost my spot, verse 11. The word keep here is the same word as verse 8, and it's the idea of to guard, to protect. So before it was God who was protecting the path, and now here it's discretion and understanding that's going to protect you. That's going to defend you from the difficulties and the challenges in life. So we'll leave it there. It's 9:51. hope that was helpful, encouraging. Any questions or comments?